A millionaire was helped by a country girl. Many days later, he and his father went to find the girl too. The asphalt stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by rolling meadows now veiled in a menacing shade of grey. John Warburton, 33, crouched lower on his Kiwi V302C as the wind pushed against him, relentless and cold. The hum of the engine beneath him had always been a source of clarity, a bridge between his carefully curated life and the untamed world outside. But today, the engine sputtered, a hesitant cough in the growing roar of the storm. John pulled to the side of the road, dismounting as the first fat raindrops splattered against his leather jacket. He scanned the horizon, his jaw tightening. Perfect, he muttered under his breath. No traffic, no service, and no sign of shelter. The countryside had seemed inviting an hour ago, but now it mocked him with its isolation. He crouched by the keyway, examining it with more hope than expertise. The chain sagged unnaturally, a sure sign he wouldn't be riding anytime soon. John exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair, slick now with rain. His phone, a sleek extension of his business empire, displayed the dreaded words, "No signal." For a man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar deals daily, the feeling of helplessness was foreign and unwelcome. "Come on," he said, more to himself than the bike, before straightening and scanning the horizon again. He swung his leg over the seat and yanked off his helmet, rain matting his hair to his forehead. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, sharp and unforgiving. He glanced around, but the road was as empty as it had been all morning. No traffic, no signs of life, just the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind and the rolling fields beyond. Through the rain's relentless drumbeat, a distant movement caught his eye. A figure on the horizon, small but distinct. It was walking toward him, an uneven gait through the muddy field, a faint outline against the storm's grey shroud. John squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A woman clad in a bulky coat and carrying a bucket trudged closer with determined steps. She wasn't running to him or shouting for attention, just methodically making her way forward, as though rescuing stranded strangers in the middle of a storm was as routine as feeding the chickens. When she reached the edge of the field, she stopped. "Problem with your motorcycle?" she called out, her voice carrying over the wind. John hesitated, surprised by the bluntness of her tone. She didn't seem particularly concerned, just observant, maybe a little annoyed. He cleared his throat, trying to project authority despite the absurdity of his situation. "Yes. Chain's stuck, and it won't start." The woman nodded once, her face shadowed beneath the brim of a drenched cap. "Figures," she said. Her tone was flat, uninterested, as though she'd seen this before, and it didn't impress her. John bristled, unused to being dismissed so easily. "Do you live nearby? Can you call for help?" "I live about half a mile that way." She gestured with her bucket toward the faint outline of a house nestled beyond the fields. "Phone's out, though. Storm's got the lines down." John exhaled sharply, wiping rain from his face. "Great. Just great." The woman adjusted the bucket in her grip, studying him for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "if you're willing to push that fancy machine, you can wait out the storm at my place. Beats standing here, whining." For a moment, John didn't move, caught off guard by the combination of practicality and sarcasm in her tone. She turned and started walking without waiting for his answer, her boots squelching in the mud. "Hey, wait," he called, grabbing the handlebars of his keyway and awkwardly maneuvering it onto the road's shoulder. The thought of leaving his bike out here wasn't an option, and she was already several paces ahead. The trek to the house was grueling. The bike slid in the mud, and the rain didn't let up for a second. His polished boots were caked in dirt, and his breath came in short, frustrated bursts. The woman, by contrast, moved steadily, barely glancing back to check on him. Finally, the small farmhouse loomed into view, its porch light flickering weakly against the storm. She opened the door and stepped inside, leaving it ajar for him. John followed, dragging the bike under the overhang and shaking rain from his jacket. The warmth of the house hit him like a slap, a sharp contrast to the cold storm outside. The woman turned to him, hands on her hips. Her face was clearer now, sharp, but not unkind. "Melissa Gomez," she said simply. "John Warburton," he replied, breathless. "Thanks for, well, not leaving me out there." She smirked just slightly. "Couldn't have you ruining the road with that bike of yours." Somewhere in her tone was a challenge, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. And for the first time in a long while, John felt the faintest flicker of curiosity about the house, the storm, and the woman who had brought him in from the rain. The house was small, weathered, and stood at the center of a sprawling field that seemed to stretch endlessly under the storm. The wind rattled the shutters as John stood on the porch, mud caking his once polished boots. Melissa pushed open the door, stepping inside with a casualness that seemed entirely at odds with the raw power of the storm behind them. "Shoes off," she said over her shoulder, not looking back. John hesitated, glancing down at the mess on his boots. "Of course," he muttered, bending to unlace them. His fingers fumbled, the rainwater dripping from his jacket pooling at his feet. By the time he stepped inside, sock-footed and shivering, Melissa was already halfway across the room, placing her bucket on a counter near a sink. The interior was modest but tidy, a world apart from the sleek lines and stainless steel of John's Manhattan apartment. The furniture was worn but sturdy, the wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of fresh herbs lingered in the air. A small table near the window bore signs of use, a pile of papers, a coffee mug, and a jar of honey, still sticky with traces of use. "You can hang that here," Melissa said, motioning toward a peg near the door, without glancing up. She pulled a kettle from the stove and filled it with water, her movements efficient and unhurried. John shrugged off his soaked jacket, hesitating as he hung it alongside hers. It was a stark contrast, his leather sleek and expensive, next to her worn canvas coat, patched at the elbows. "Melissa?" A voice, deep and steady, called from another room. "In here, Dad," she replied, loud enough to carry. Moments later, an older man appeared in the doorway. He moved slowly, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Gabriel Gomez had the kind of presence that didn't need words to command attention. He took one look at John, still standing awkwardly near the door, and gave a single nod. "Storm caught you?" Gabriel asked, his voice low and even. "Yeah," John said, shifting under the older man's gaze. "Bike broke down on the road. Your daughter found me." Gabriel's mouth twitched slightly, the ghost of a smile. "She's good at that, finding people who look like they're about to get washed away." "Dad?" Melissa said, the word carrying a mixture of affection and exasperation. She placed 3 mugs on the table and poured tea from the steaming kettle. "He can stay until it clears up." Gabriel didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking between his daughter and their unexpected guest. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured to the table. "You must be hungry." John hesitated again. Politeness dictated he accept, but everything about this situation, this house, these people, felt so far removed from his reality that he wasn't sure what to say. Melissa didn't wait for a response. "Sit down before you fall over," she said, pulling out a chair for him. He obliged, lowering himself into the seat and noticing how the edges of the wooden chair were smooth, worn from years of use. Melissa placed a mug in front of him, the steam curling upward, faintly herbal. Gabriel sat down across from him, folding his hands. "So," he said, his gaze steady. "What takes a man like you out on these roads?" "A man like me?" John echoed, bristling slightly at the phrasing. Gabriel raised a brow, his expression unreadable. "Those boots," he said after a pause, "aren't made for mud." Melissa, leaning against the counter with her own mug, smirked. "He's right." John took a breath, setting his mug down. "I needed a break," he said simply. "Thought the countryside would be peaceful." Gabriel nodded slowly, as if the answer wasn't unexpected, and found a storm instead. "It's different from the city," John admitted, glancing around. Melissa let out a quiet laugh, her eyes meeting his. "That's one way to put it." The tension in the room softened slightly, though the unease lingered. John could feel their scrutiny, not unkind but deliberate, as though they were measuring the weight of his presence in their space. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window where the rain continued to lash against the glass. "Storm won't let up until morning," he said finally. "You'll have to stay the night." John's immediate instinct was to protest, to assert that he could manage on his own, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Melissa, her expression expectant but calm, then back at Gabriel, whose unspoken authority filled the room. "Thank you," he said after a moment, his voice quieter. Gabriel nodded once, his approval subtle but clear. Melissa pushed off the counter and began clearing the table. "There's a spare room," she said matter-of-factly. "It's not much, but it's dry." John gave a faint smile, though he wasn't sure if it was gratitude or discomfort that showed in his face. "Dry sounds good." It's been a long time. John Warburton felt small, out of his depth in a place where his wealth and status held no meaning. The storm out roared on, but within the walls of the Gomez home, it was the quiet strength of simplicity that spoke the loudest. The storm did not relent the next morning. Sheets of rain fell in unending waves, drumming against the tin roof of the Gomez home. The fields outside, visible through fogged windows, glistened under the downpour. For John Warburton, accustomed to a life of efficiency and control, the storm's persistence felt like a personal affront. He had woken early. His internal clock was still set to the city's ceaseless rhythm. The spare room where he had slept was sparse, but surprisingly comfortable. A handmade quilt had kept the chill at bay, and the faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. Still, he had been restless, the unfamiliar quiet pressing on him in a way that even Manhattan's chaos never had. When he ventured into the kitchen, he found Melissa already at work, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, boots caked in fresh mud. She was rinsing vegetables at the sink, her hands deft and sure. Gabriel sat at the table, reading a worn paperback, his coffee steaming beside him. John cleared his throat. "Morning." Melissa glanced up briefly. "Hope you slept well," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "Well enough." He hesitated, unsure where to position himself in a space so clearly lived in. Gabriel gestured to the chair across from him. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, his voice as steady as ever. John poured himself a cup, the aroma richer than he expected. He sat down, the mug warming his hands as silence settled over the room. Outside, the wind howled. "Looks like I'm stuck here for a while," John said finally, breaking the quiet. Melissa shrugged, setting the rinsed vegetables aside. "Storm'll pass when it's ready." Gabriel glanced up from his book, his eyes keen. "Impatient, are you?" "Not impatient," John said, though he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. "I'm just used to keeping busy." "Plenty to keep busy with here," Melissa said, her tone laced with dry amusement. Before John could respond, Gabriel set his book down. "She's right. If you're looking to fill time, there's work to be done. Hands don't sit idle in this house." By midday, John found himself standing in the barn, a pitchfork in hand. The smell of hay and earth was overwhelming, and his clothes, borrowed from Gabriel, hung awkwardly on his frame. Melissa was nearby, stacking bales with practiced efficiency. "You've never done this before," she observed, not unkindly. "Is it that obvious?" John replied, attempting to mimic her movements. Melissa smirked. "You're holding that like it's going to bite you." He huffed, adjusting his grip. "City boy, remember." No kidding. Despite her teasing, Melissa showed him the proper technique. Her instructions were succinct, but clear. Gradually the task became manageable, though John's arms ached from the unfamiliar strain. The hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the occasional exchange. As they worked, John caught glimpses of the life Melissa and Gabriel had built, a life defined by resilience and purpose. The barn, though old, was well maintained. Tools hung neatly on the walls, their handles polished from use. Even the animals seemed content, their movements deliberate and unhurried. That evening, the three of them sat by the fireplace, the storm still raging outside. The warmth of the flames cast long shadows across the room, and the sound of crackling wood filled the quiet spaces between their words. John leaned back in his chair, his mug of tea resting on his knee. "You've got something here," he said, his voice thoughtful. Melissa glanced at him. "Something?" "This place, your life, it's different." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Simple, but not in a negative way. There's integrity to it." Gabriel, who had been silent, gave a slight nod. "You don't see that often, do you?" John shook his head. "Not where I'm from. Everything's about the next big thing. Growth, expansion, profit margins. It's all—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing. "It's exhausting, honestly." Melissa studied him, her expression unreadable. "So why do you do it?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortably direct. John stared into the fire, the flames flickering in his eyes. "Because I'm supposed to. Because it's what I'm good at. At least, that's what I tell myself." Gabriel's voice broke the silence, quiet, but firm. "Good at something doesn't mean it's what you're meant for." John looked up, startled by the weight of the words. Melissa leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "What are you looking for, John?" she asked, her tone softer now. He didn't answer immediately. The fire crackled, the storm rumbled, and for the first time in a long while, John allowed himself to sit with the question. "I don't know," he admitted finally, the words heavy but freeing. Melissa didn't press further. Instead, she sat back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Well," she said, "the storm won't last forever. Maybe you'll figure it out before it ends." Her words lingered long after the fire died down, carrying a quiet truth that John couldn't ignore. The morning dawned still and bright, the storm finally retreating. The fields glistened under the fresh sunlight, every blade of grass adorned with droplets that caught the light like tiny crystals. John stood outside the Gomez home, shielding his eyes against the sun, his Keyway Davidson once again standing upright and functional. A repair crew had arrived not long after breakfast, summoned by a series of Gabriel's deliberate calls once the phone lines had been restored. Melissa watched from the porch, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but her usual composure seemed tinged with something more subdued. Gabriel leaned against the doorway, a silent presence, his face set in its usual calm. John turned to them, adjusting his jacket with a practiced tug. "I owe you both more than I can say," he began, his tone measured but sincere. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open with an air of finality. "Here, for everything." Melissa stiffened. She stepped forward, her boots thudding softly on the wooden porch. "Put that away," she said, her voice clipped. John blinked. At least let me—" "No." Melissa's tone was firm, her eyes unwavering. "We helped you because you needed it, not because we expected payment." He hesitated, the wallet still in his hand. "That's generous," he said, the words landing awkwardly. "It's not generosity," she replied, her voice softening just slightly. "It's just what people do." Gabriel nodded from his place in the doorway, his gaze steady on John. "Out here, you rely on each other. That's the way it works." John slid the wallet back into his pocket, his movements slow, almost reluctant. He looked between the two of them, his polished demeanor faltering for the briefest moment. "You're rare," he said finally, almost to himself. Melissa didn't respond, her arms crossing once more. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. John shifted his stance, glancing down at the gravel path that led away from the house. He cleared his throat. "You know, you're talented at this," he said. "At what?" "Everything. Running this farm, fixing things, keeping your dad from killing me in my sleep." She smirked. "It's a talent." "I'm serious," he continued. "You know a lot. About food, sustainability, the kind of stuff people like me throw money at without understanding. You could do a lot more with it." Melissa's brow furrowed, her bemusement giving way to curiosity. "What are you getting at?" "It's more than that," John replied. It's not something I see every day." He hesitated again, then looked directly at her. "Melissa, have you ever thought about doing more with what you know?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He paused, his words measured. "You have a real understanding of food, where it comes from, how it works. It's more than most people in my world can say. You could make an impact, a real one, if you wanted to." Melissa studied him, her expression unreadable. "And where exactly would I do that?" "With me," John said simply. "At my company. I run a food business, and frankly, we could use someone like you in product research, someone who gets the roots of it all." Gabriel's gaze shifted to his daughter, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. Melissa didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened briefly around her elbows, her stance rigid. "I'm not a corporate person," she said at last. "I'm not asking you to be," John countered. "Just think about it. You'd have the resources to make real change, and you'd be helping people." She glanced at Gabriel, who gave her a slight nod, his silent encouragement clear. Melissa exhaled through her nose, her shoulders easing slightly. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That's all I'm asking," John replied, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. The crew signaled that the bike was ready, its engine rumbling softly as it idled. John stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He turned back one last time, his eyes meeting Melissa's. "Thank you," he said simply. Melissa nodded, her expression steady, but her eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or the faintest trace of melancholy. As John swung his leg over the keyway, he hesitated, his fingers lingering on the handlebars. A vague longing tugged at him, unnameable, but undeniable. He revved the engine and tipped his head in farewell before pulling away, the sound of the bike fading into the distance. Melissa stood on the porch long after he disappeared from view, her arms falling loosely to her sides. Gabriel joined her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the empty road. "Yeah," she said, though her voice was softer than usual. "It's just... he's not what I expected." Gabriel chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Life has a way of surprising us." Melissa didn't reply, but as the wind stirred the fields around them, she couldn't help wondering if this storm had brought more than just rain. The decision hadn't come easily. Melissa had spent days turning it over in her mind, walking the edges of the fields and consulting Gabriel, who'd listened with his usual quiet patience. It wasn't the lure of the city or the idea of working for someone like John that swayed her. It was the chance to expand what she knew, to take what she'd learned on the farm and see if it could matter beyond their acres of land. "It's your call, kid," Gabriel had said one evening, leaning back in his chair on the porch. The twilight bathed his face in soft light. "But if you've got a chance to do something good, don't let fear stop you." The next morning, she called John. His voice had carried a mix of surprise and genuine pleasure over the line. "You won't regret it," he'd said, the confidence in his tone both reassuring and faintly unnerving. Now, weeks later, Melissa found herself standing in the gleaming lobby of Warburton Foods, her boots replaced by sensible flats, and her hair swept back into a professional braid. The hum of New York City felt like a constant backdrop, a stark contrast to the quiet rhythms of the farm. From the moment she joined, Melissa was an anomaly. In a corporate environment where appearances and profit margins ruled, her straightforward manner and practical expertise stood out. Her ideas about sustainable sourcing and minimizing food waste were unpolished, but grounded in a kind of wisdom her colleagues found unfamiliar and occasionally threatening. Her first few meetings were an exercise in patience. She quickly realized that speaking plainly, as she did on the farm, wasn't enough to cut through the layers of jargon and posturing. She adapted, learning to frame her ideas in ways that caught attention without compromising her principles. John, to his credit, backed her unconditionally. He often sat in on her presentations, arms crossed, but his gaze unwavering, nodding at key moments. It was clear to everyone in the room that he respected her, and that alone made her words difficult to dismiss. But not everyone was pleased with Melissa's arrival. Amanda, John's personal assistant, had watched Melissa's integration into the company with growing unease. She wasn't used to competition for John's attention, especially from someone so seemingly unpolished. Melissa's successes only deepened Amanda's resentment, and she began finding subtle ways to undermine her. "Are you sure this is the right format for your report?" Amanda would ask in passing, her tone dripping with faux concern. "The executives can be particular." Melissa, unfazed, would thank her tersely and return to her work, often double-checking her output just in case. Amanda's efforts escalated. One afternoon, Melissa discovered that her notes for a critical presentation had been replaced with outdated data. She barely caught the error in time, improvising with a calm that belied her fury. John noticed. He watched from the back of the room during one of Melissa's presentations, his expression unreadable, but his focus sharp. Later that day, he approached her in her small, sparsely decorated office. "You handled that well," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Melissa glanced up from her screen, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I saw what happened with the notes," John said simply. "That wasn't an accident." Melissa's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "I'll deal with it," John continued. "There's no need," Melissa replied, her voice steady but firm. "I can handle it." John studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "I know you can." "That's not the point." She looked away, focusing on the plant she'd brought from home, a small basil sprout that thrived on her windowsill. "I don't want to start something unnecessary," she said finally. John straightened, his expression thoughtful. "You're tougher than you look, Melissa, but don't let that stop you from letting people have your back once in a while." She didn't respond, and he left without pressing further. The clash came to a head 2 weeks later. Amanda, desperate to regain control, tried to frame Melissa for a delay in a major project. The accusation came during a team meeting, her tone laced with false sympathy. "Melissa, I know you're new, but this kind of oversight could have been costly," Amanda said, her words calculated to seem constructive. Melissa's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, John interjected. "Stop," he said, his tone sharp enough to draw every gaze in the room. Amanda froze, her confidence wavering. "I reviewed the timeline myself," John continued, his eyes locking on hers. "Melissa had nothing to do with the delay. If anything, she saved this project from running further behind." The room fell silent. Amanda's face reddened, her attempts to recover drowned out by John's unyielding authority. Melissa said nothing, though a faint flicker of gratitude passed through her features. Are the people listening to this story working or retired? Leave your information in the comments section below, and if you have any interesting stories from the office, please share them with us. That evening, as she walked home, Melissa replayed the day's events in her mind. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. For all its challenges, the corporate world had taught her something she hadn't expected. Resilience wasn't just about standing firm. It was about knowing when to let others stand with you. And, though she wouldn't admit it aloud, she was beginning to feel that John Warburton might be one of those rare people worth trusting. Melissa sat at her desk, staring at the blank page of her notebook. The quiet hum of Warburton Foods' bustling office surrounded her, a faint backdrop of clicking keyboards, murmured conversations, and the occasional clatter of coffee mugs. Ideas churned in her mind, fragments of plans she was determined to weave into something cohesive. The project John had entrusted her with was ambitious: redesign a significant portion of their product line to incorporate sustainably sourced fresh ingredients. For Melissa, it was an opportunity to bring a slice of her world into a place that desperately needed it. But the weight of expectation loomed large. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and began sketching her thoughts. Ideas for supplier networks, partnerships with local farms, and a system to ensure quality while minimizing waste. Her handwriting was quick and sharp, the lines and arrows reflecting the methodical way her mind worked. John stopped by her office later that morning, his usual air of relaxed authority tempered by genuine curiosity. "How's it coming along?" Melissa set down her pen and turned to him. "Slow but good. The challenging part is figuring out how to scale it without losing the integrity." John leaned against the doorframe, nodding thoughtfully. "You'll find a way. You always do." There was something in his tone, unwavering confidence that bolstered her resolve. As the weeks passed, Melissa's vision began to take shape. She spent hours poring over supply chain logistics, meeting with teams across departments, and visiting potential suppliers. Her approach was meticulous but grounded, and it began to draw attention. "She's onto something," one senior executive remarked during a meeting, gesturing toward Melissa's latest proposal. "She's been on to something since day one," John said without hesitation, his tone light but firm. His eyes flicked to Melissa, and for a moment she thought she caught a trace of pride. The praise, while gratifying, wasn't without consequence. Amanda's growing resentment simmered beneath the surface, her frustration bubbling into increasingly overt attempts to discredit Melissa. "Don't you think this plan is a bit idealistic?" Amanda said one afternoon, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest skepticism. "I mean, sure, it's fantastic in theory, but do you really think we can implement something like this without driving up costs?" Melissa didn't flinch. "The numbers support it," she replied, holding Amanda's gaze. "If we're strategic about partnerships and streamline certain processes, we can make it work." John, seated at the head of the conference table, observed the exchange with interest. He didn't intervene, but made a note to follow up later. It was during one of these follow-ups, late in the evening, that John found himself lingering in Melissa's office. "You're doing excellent work," he said, leaning against the edge of her desk. Melissa looked up from her notes, her brow furrowing slightly. "Thanks." He tilted his head, studying her. "But?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's different. The work itself is fine, but navigating all the politics, it's exhausting." John chuckled softly, a rueful smile on his face. "Welcome to the labyrinth." Melissa smirked, though her expression softened as she looked at him. "How do you do it?" "What?" "Stay sane in all this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the office, the company, and the city. John's smile faded, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. "For a long time I didn't. I just went through the motions. Did what I thought I was supposed to do." Melissa tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "And now?" His gaze held hers, steady but unguarded. "Now, I'm trying to figure out what matters, and—" He stopped himself, clearing his throat. "Anyway, this isn't about me. You're the one making waves here." Melissa raised an eyebrow, but she didn't press him further. "Making waves is easy when you're trying to fix something that's broken." John straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but fixing it takes more than most people are willing to give. You're doing more than making waves, Melissa. You're changing things." Her cheeks warmed at the compliment, though she quickly busied herself with her notes. "Well, let's hope it sticks," she said lightly. By the time the project entered its final stages, Melissa's reputation within the company had shifted. She was no longer the anomaly, the farm girl with unpolished ideas. She was a force to be reckoned with, her passion and expertise undeniable. Even Amanda couldn't deny her results, though her hostility only grew more pointed. John's open praise for Melissa in meetings and his willingness to listen to her ideas and champion her vision only deepened the rift. But Melissa had no time for Amanda's pettiness. She was too focused on the work, on proving to herself, and perhaps to John, that she was capable of more than even she had believed. For John, watching Melissa thrive was a revelation. Her unwavering focus, her refusal to compromise her values, her ability to challenge the status quo, all of it stirred something in him. It wasn't just admiration. It was a quiet, insistent realization. She embodied qualities he hadn't even known he valued: integrity, resilience, authenticity. And the more he saw it, the more he questioned his own life and his own choices. The idea had come to John as he reviewed the final stages of Melissa's project. Her success was undeniable, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than routine pride in his company. It wasn't just the progress or the glowing feedback from stakeholders, it was watching Melissa transform Warburton Foods from the inside out. He approached her office that afternoon, knocking softly on the doorframe. Melissa glanced up from her computer, the faint lines of concentration on her face softening when she saw him. "Busy?" he asked, stepping inside. "Always," she replied, though there was a teasing edge to her tone. "What's up?" John leaned against her desk, a familiar gesture by now. "You've done incredible work, Melissa. Really. I don't say this lightly. Your project is going to change the way we do things." Melissa smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thanks. But something tells me you didn't come in here just to say that." He chuckled. "You know me too well already." Straightening, he shoved his hands into his pockets. "I wanted to invite you to dinner, at my father's place." She blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner?" "Yeah. We're celebrating the project's success, and I think it's important you're there. After all, it's your vision that's making this happen." Melissa hesitated. The idea of sitting around a table with John's family, his father no less, felt daunting. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," John said firmly. "Besides, my dad will love you. He has a soft spot for people who know what they're doing." Melissa tilted her head, studying him. "All right," she said slowly, "if you're sure I won't be crashing the party." John grinned. "Melissa, you're the guest of honor." Albert Warburton's home was as impressive as John's presence had always suggested. Set on the outskirts of the city, the sprawling estate was equal parts stately and welcoming, with large bay windows and meticulously maintained gardens. Melissa stepped out of the car, smoothing the front of her blouse. She had dressed carefully, aiming for something professional, yet approachable. John, ever the gentleman, offered his arm as they ascended the wide stone steps. "Relax," he murmured as they reached the door. "My dad isn't as intimidating as the house." The door opened before Melissa could respond, revealing a tall man with striking silver hair and sharp blue eyes. Albert Warburton's presence was immediately commanding, though his warm smile softened the effect. "Melissa, welcome," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but kind. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good, I hope," Melissa replied, her voice steady, despite the nerves flickering in her chest. Albert chuckled. "All good." The dinner itself was a mixture of formality and familiarity. The dining room was grand, the table set with fine china and crystal glasses, but Albert's casual demeanor kept the atmosphere light. Melissa found herself drawn into conversations about the project, her ideas, and her experiences growing up on the farm. It was during dessert that Albert paused, his gaze lingering on Melissa. "You mentioned your father's name is Gabriel, right?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. Melissa nodded. "Yes, Gabriel Gomez. Why?" Albert leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That name sounds familiar. Did he grow up in a small town near the Hudson River?" Melissa tilted her head. "He did. How do you know that?" For a moment, Albert didn't answer. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "I knew a Gabriel Gomez once. We were kids together. Best friends, actually. He taught me how to fish, and I taught him how to climb trees." Melissa's eyes widened. "That sounds like my dad." John, who had been watching the exchange with interest, leaned forward. "You never mentioned this, Dad." Albert shrugged, his smile turning wistful. "It was a long time ago. Life took us in different directions." "Wait," Melissa said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "You're saying you and my dad were childhood friends?" "It sounds that way," Albert said with a chuckle. "Does he still have that scar on his left hand? Got it climbing the old oak tree behind the schoolhouse?" Melissa's mouth fell open. "He does. He told me he got it climbing a tree, but he never mentioned you were there." Albert laughed, the sound rich and warm. "That's Gabriel, all right. Always modest. I'd love to see him again." The revelation left a ripple of surprise and warmth across the table. For John, it felt as though an invisible thread had tied their worlds together in an unexpected but deeply meaningful way. Later, as John walked Melissa to her car, the night air cool and crisp, he glanced at her with a quiet smile. "Small world, huh?" Melissa shook her head, still processing. "Smaller than I thought." He stopped, turning to face her fully. "I don't think this is just coincidence, Melissa. There's something about this, about us, that feels connected." She met his gaze, her expression softening. "Maybe," she said quietly. But either way, it's helpful to know our worlds aren't as far apart as I thought." John nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he opened the car door for her. As she drove away, Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had been more than a family dinner. It had been a bridge between past and present, one she hadn't expected but was starting to cherish. The tension in the room was palpable. Warburton Foods' executive meeting had been routine up to this point: financial updates, project reports, and the usual parade of PowerPoint slides. Then Amanda spoke. "Before we move on," she began, her tone measured but carrying an edge of false concern, "I think it's important we address an issue with the latest sustainability initiative." Melissa, seated a few chairs down, looked up from her notes, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. She hadn't been informed of any issues. Amanda continued, pulling out a printed document and sliding it toward John at the head of the table. There was a miscalculation in the supply chain analysis for the pilot program. Unfortunately, this oversight could result in significant delays and cost overruns. The eyes of the room turned toward Melissa. John frowned as he picked up the document, scanning its contents. "This analysis doesn't look familiar," he said, his tone sharp. "That's because it wasn't caught during initial reviews," Amanda replied smoothly. "I'm not pointing fingers, but since Melissa spearheaded this project—" She trailed off, her implication hanging heavily in the air. Melissa's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. "May I see that?" she asked. John passed her the document without a word, his expression unreadable. Melissa's eyes darted over the numbers, her mind working quickly. Within moments, she spotted the inconsistencies. "This data is outdated," she said firmly, placing the document back on the table. "These projections were revised weeks ago. The current numbers don't show any delays or cost increases." Amanda leaned back in her chair, her brow arching in mock surprise. "Are you sure? These figures were sent to me this morning." Melissa met her gaze evenly. "I'm certain. I updated the file myself, and it was reviewed by the team." John, who had been silent until now, set his hands flat on the table. "Amanda," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "where exactly did you get this data?" Amanda hesitated for the briefest moment, her composure slipping. "From the shared drive," she said quickly. "That's odd," John replied, his tone deceptively calm. "Because I reviewed the final projections last night, and they match Melissa's version." The room fell silent. Amanda's confident veneer began to crack under the weight of John's gaze. "Melissa," John continued, turning to her, "would you mind pulling up the current file?" Melissa nodded, her hands steady as she opened her laptop and navigated to the document. She projected it onto the screen at the front of the room, highlighting the updated figures. "As you can see," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "the project is on schedule and within budget. These numbers were approved and circulated to all relevant stakeholders." John leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Amanda. "Well," he said, his tone deceptively light, "it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Or something more deliberate." Amanda's face reddened, her attempt to formulate a response faltering under the scrutiny of the room. Perhaps I misunderstood the files I accessed," she stammered. "It wasn't intentional." John's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I suggest you double-check your sources in the future. We can't afford to waste time on baseless accusations." Amanda nodded stiffly, her gaze fixed on the table as the meeting moved on. After the meeting, Melissa lingered in her office, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins. She stared out the window, the city skyline a blur of glass and steel. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she said, turning to see John step inside. "Hell of a meeting," he said, his tone light but his expression serious. Melissa crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. "You didn't have to step in like that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "I'm not going to let someone undermine you, especially when they're wrong." Melissa studied him, her gaze steady. "I can handle myself, you know." John smiled faintly. "I know. But that doesn't mean you have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice softer. John nodded, stepping closer. "You handled it with grace, Melissa. The team noticed. They respect you, and they should." Melissa felt a warmth rise in her chest, though she quickly pushed it aside. "Well, let's hope Amanda learns her lesson." "She will," John said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at her. "You're changing things here, Melissa, and not just with your project. You're changing me too." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with a realization she wasn't quite ready to face. For John, the events of the day had only solidified what he already knew. Melissa wasn't just a remarkable professional. She was a remarkable person. And he was determined to show her exactly how much she meant to him. Melissa leaned against the porch railing of the Gomez family farm, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The fields, golden under the late afternoon sun, swayed gently in the breeze. A familiar rhythm that had always soothed her. She had needed to come back. The pace and tension of the city, of Warburton Foods, had been relentless, and the incident with Amanda had left her raw, despite her composed exterior. Gabriel stepped out onto the porch, a mug of coffee in hand. "It's good to see you home," he said, his voice warm and steady. Melissa smiled faintly. "It's good to be here." Gabriel settled into a chair, studying her. "Something's weighing on you." She sighed, sinking into the chair beside him. "It's just a lot. The work, the politics, trying to prove myself over and over again. And then there's John." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "What about him?" Melissa hesitated, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. "He's been supportive, more than I expected. But it's complicated. I don't know if I'm ready to trust what I'm feeling." Gabriel nodded thoughtfully. "Trust isn't easy. But you've always known how to listen to your instincts. What are they telling you now?" "That may be..." Melissa paused, the words catching in her throat. "That maybe he's different, and maybe I want to see where that leads." Gabriel chuckled softly, the sound rich with understanding. "Then that's your answer, kid. Don't let fear hold you back from something good." Melissa leaned back, letting his words sink in. The sun dipped lower, casting the fields in hues of amber and gold. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. Melissa and Gabriel turned to see a sleek car pulling up the driveway. The driver's door opened, and John stepped out, followed by a tall man with silver hair. "John," Melissa said, rising from her chair. John waved, his expression equal parts excitement and nervousness. "I hope we're not interrupting." Gabriel stood, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied the older man. "Albert Warburton," the man said, extending a hand toward Gabriel. Gabriel's face softened as recognition dawned. "Well, I'll be damned." "Albert?" Albert grinned, shaking Gabriel's hand firmly. "It's been a long time, my friend." The two men exchanged a flurry of greetings and questions, their voices overlapping as years of distance melted away. John watched with quiet satisfaction, his gaze drifting toward Melissa. "I thought it was time our fathers met again," he said softly. Melissa's lips curved into a smile. "That was thoughtful. I had a feeling it would mean something to both of them." Gabriel and Albert settled into chairs, their conversation flowing with ease as they recounted shared memories of boyhood adventures and the paths their lives had taken. "You still have that scar?" Albert asked, pointing to Gabriel's left hand. Gabriel laughed, holding up his hand to show the faint line. "Of course. You didn't warn me that branch was rotten." "You didn't ask," Albert retorted, both men laughing heartily. Melissa and John stood a little apart, watching the reunion unfold. "It's strange, isn't it?" Melissa said quietly. "How connected our lives have been without us even realizing it." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's like, our paths were meant to cross, one way or another." Melissa turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Do you believe that?" He hesitated, then nodded again. "I think I do. And I think there's more to it than just coincidence." Melissa's gaze softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her usual composure. "I'm starting to think so, too." As the evening wore on, the four of them shared a meal on the porch, the conversation lively and full of warmth. Gabriel and Albert traded stories late into the night, their laughter echoing across the fields. When the stars began to emerge, Melissa and John found themselves standing at the edge of the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them. "Thank you for bringing him," Melissa said, her voice quiet but earnest. John smiled, his hands in his pockets. "It felt like the right thing to do, and I think it's good for us too. Seeing how connected our families are, it makes everything feel real." Melissa looked up at him, her heart catching at the sincerity in his eyes. "It does," she admitted. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the fields. Then John reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. "Melissa," he began, his voice steady, "I know this hasn't been easy, for either of us. But I need you to know, I'm here, for whatever this is, for however long it takes. I'm here." Her breath hitched, and for once she let herself believe him. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, "to see where this leads." John's smile widened, his hand closing gently around hers. The connection, once distant and uncertain, now felt as steady as the earth beneath their feet. Together, they looked out over the fields, the stars above shining brighter than ever. The farm's air was cool and damp in the early morning as John rolled up his sleeves, staring at the wheelbarrow in front of him. Gabriel had chuckled as he handed over a pair of work gloves. "We don't do business deals here," he said with a smirk. "We work." Melissa stood nearby, leaning against the barn door with her arms crossed, her face a mix of amusement and skepticism. "You sure about this, Warburton? These hands don't exactly scream manual labor." John gave her a pointed look, slipping the gloves on with exaggerated precision. "Watch and learn." The tasks were simple but relentless: hauling hay, stacking feed bags, and repairing fencing. John's polished demeanor faded as he pushed through the work, sweat dampening his shirt and dirt smudging his forearms. Melissa occasionally joined in, guiding him with a mixture of teasing and practicality. "You're gripping the pitchfork wrong," she said, stepping behind him to adjust his stance. He glanced over his shoulder. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "More than you know," she replied, a grin tugging at her lips. But as the hours wore on, something shifted. John's movements grew steadier and more deliberate, and his frustration melted into a quiet rhythm. The satisfaction of a task completed, no matter how small, began to take hold. At midday, Gabriel called them to the porch, where sandwiches and lemonade awaited. John collapsed into a chair, brushing his damp hair back. "You're still alive," Melissa teased, sitting beside him. "Barely," he quipped, but there was a trace of pride in his voice. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful as he observed the two of them. "It's beneficial to see people earn their rest," he said. John met his gaze, nodding. "I think I'm starting to understand that." Melissa's expression softened as she watched John. For all his confidence and charm, there was a humility in the way he approached this unfamiliar world, a willingness to learn and adapt. Later that evening, Melissa and John sat by the fence line, the fields bathed in golden light as the sun dipped below the horizon. "You're quieter than usual," Melissa remarked, glancing at him. John rested his arms on the fence, staring out at the horizon. "I've been thinking," he admitted. About how different this feels," he said. "I've spent years chasing results, trying to prove myself in boardrooms and numbers. But here, everything's simpler. It's not about winning or losing, it's just about doing the work, being present." Melissa tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "And what do you think of it?" "I think," he said, turning to her, "that it's something I've been missing." Melissa's chest tightened at his words. For all his sophistication and success, there was something achingly human about John in that moment, vulnerable and sincere. "And you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Do you think you've changed since we met?" Melissa hesitated, her fingers tracing the rough wood of the fence. "I think you've reminded me that I'm allowed to want more," she said. "That it's okay to step outside of what I know and trust that I'll figure it out." John's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "I think we've been beneficial for each other," he said softly. She met his eyes, a flicker of emotion passing between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Inside the house, Gabriel sat in his usual chair, sipping coffee as he watched the two of them through the window. When Melissa came in later, he motioned for her to sit beside him. "How are you feeling about all this?" he asked, his voice steady but warm. Melissa sank into the chair, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know. It's a lot. But good, I think," Gabriel nodded. "You've always been strong, kid. But strength doesn't mean closing yourself off. If this feels right, don't let fear stop you." Melissa looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think he's different?" "I think he's trying," Gabriel said simply. "And trying counts for a lot." She smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "You've always known what to say." Gabriel chuckled. "That's what dads are for." When John came back inside, Gabriel clapped him on the shoulder. "You survived your first day," he said, a teasing glint in his eye. "Barely," John replied, but there was a warmth in his smile that hadn't been there before. As the evening wound down, Melissa walked John to his car, the stars overhead casting a soft glow. "Thank you," John said, his voice quiet. "For what?" "For letting me see this, for letting me be part of it." Melissa hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You didn't have to do any of it, John, but you did. That says more than you know." His hand covered hers. The gesture was simple, but full of meaning. "I don't think I've ever wanted something to work as much as I want this to," he said softly. Melissa smiled, her heart full, but steady. "Then we'll figure it out," she said. The rumble of John's motorbike echoed through the countryside, the crisp wind tugging at Melissa's hair as she sat behind him, her arms loosely wrapped around his waist. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon, winding through fields and forests, its bends and turns reminiscent of the path they had taken to find each other. "Recognize this," John called over his shoulder, slowing the bike as they approached a familiar stretch of road. Melissa smiled, the memory of their first meeting flickering to life. "Hard to forget," she replied, her voice carried by the wind. John pulled the bike to a stop on the gravel shoulder, cutting the engine. The sudden quiet was striking, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. They dismounted, Melissa smoothing her hair as she took in the scene. The landscape was just as she remembered, wild and open, with the sky stretching endlessly above. "I thought it'd be fitting to come back here," John said, leaning against the bike, "where it all started." Melissa crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Feeling nostalgic, Warburton?" "Something like that," he said, his tone soft but earnest. They walked a short distance to a clearing where the grass was lush and the sky above was beginning to darken with the first hints of twilight. John spread out a small blanket he had packed, motioning for Melissa to sit. As the stars began to emerge, they talked, their conversation winding through memories and dreams. There was laughter, easy and genuine, and stretches of silence that felt equally full, charged with an unspoken understanding. "You know," John said after a while, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what matters, what I want out of life." Melissa turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "And?" "And it keeps leading back to you," he said simply, his voice steady. Her breath caught, her heart quickening. John shifted, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring that caught the starlight. "Melissa," he said, kneeling before her, his eyes holding hers with unwavering sincerity. "You've changed everything for me. You've shown me what it means to be grounded and to care about something real. I don't just want you in my life. I need you. Will you marry me?" Melissa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. For a moment, she could only nod. The words caught in her throat. Then, finding her voice, she said, "Yes, John. Of course, yes." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood, pulling her to her feet and wrapping her in an embrace that felt as solid and unshakable as the earth beneath them. They stayed like that for a moment, the world around them fading away. When they finally pulled back, Melissa laughed softly, brushing away a tear. "I didn't think you could surprise me anymore," she said. John grinned. "Stick around. I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve." Later, as they rode back under the vast expanse of stars, Melissa leaned into John, the warmth of his presence wrapping around her like a shield against the cool night air. For the first time in years, she felt completely certain of him, of herself, of the future they were building together. And as the road stretched out before them, she knew that wherever it led, they would face it side by side, partners and equals, ready for whatever lay ahead. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.